But there's love. Love is also an emotion and an emotional attachment that you can have this. And this is what's interesting as a historian, is that we can be talking about species that haven't been in a landscape for a person's lifetime. So they haven't been there because they've been extinct in these cases. And yet there's still an emotional attachment to them.
Hello, I am Michael Yadrick, the host of Tree Hugger Podcast, and I am broadcasting from the land of the Puyallup people, now also known as Grit City, Tacoma, Washington. This is the show where we explore the feelings of grief, loss, and hope around reintroduction, rewilding, and resurrection of lost species. I sat down for a Zencastr chat beaming between Tacoma and Norway with Dr. Dolly Jørgensen, who is a historian of the environment and technology and an environmental humanities scholar. After tuning into her virtual book talk at the Society for Ecological Restoration World Conference in June, I turned around and invited her to be on the show. Her current research focuses on cultural histories of animal extinction, and in 2019 she published Recovering Lost Species in the Modern Age, Histories of Longing and Belonging, from MIT Press. She's interested in how human technology shaped the world around us and how we come to understand what is natural and what is not. I am grateful to Dolly for helping bring some perspective on some issues that have provided a consistent undercurrent throughout almost every Tree Hugger episode, such as rewilding, this time on a macro scale, losing and potentially finding ourselves or other parts of nature, navigating through environmental change, and reimagining what restoration is and is not. To help this story and show you some feelings we have associated with the real absence or potential loss of species, I recorded a bit with my friend Brandon Drucker as part of a forthcoming episode about protection and restoration of our local oaks. I set him up a bit by asking if he had an oak story that he tells himself or tells other people, like the first time he saw oaks.
So my name's Brandon Drucker. I am a restoration practitioner. I've worked in Gary Oak systems since college. Yeah, she took me out this long winding road, right, out into this bald system, and we were looking for some rare understory plants, and they were growing below these massive sprawling oak trees. It was serpentine habitat. There were kind of lizards scuttling around, sunning themselves on the serpentine rocks, and it was clear that the oaks were the keystone species, right? They were really kind of central. Everything else kind of was in their orbit, it felt like to me.
Everything else was in their orbit, he says. You can tell that Brandon knows how special oaks are. There are different species that rely on them, and people rely on them too. I asked him next, how do you feel knowing that there's just so few of them around compared to what we know historically existed?
Yeah, I mean, so there's stories of early Euro-American explorers riding on horseback, like all the way from the bottom of the Willamette Valley all the way north to Canada, and the story is they, like, between the horses, you know, people looking between the horses' ears would just see open savanna. There was a path all the way up, all through that corridor. And when you hear stories like that and think about what's left, it's hard not to feel a sense of loss for so many reasons. But again, because that system is so tied to the culture, yeah, that's at the forefront of my mind.
Mm-hmm. Given our very special human knack for forecasting into the future, I did ask Brandon, what do you have in your mind as a vision, thinking ahead 25 years from now and looking back on how things have changed? What do you see?
It's going to sound silly to some people, but I see fields of color. I see fields of flowers, and I see butterflies and pollinators buzzing around. I see a restoration of the understory. Right, because we have a lot of the overstory in these relict patches, but we don't have hardly any of that biologically diverse understory that I was talking about earlier that exists at JBLM. And I think people connect so much with the trees, and that's critical, and I want to see more trees planted as well. But in some of these older stands, I think people could also benefit so much from digging up camas bulbs, right, and connecting to that traditional foraging. I think people could benefit a lot from just being all of the flowers, right, and the color, and seeing the deer and the elk come in and take advantage of all the foods that are now available to them once more.
Thanks to Brandon for allowing me to take our conversation out of context, and to Dr. Jørgensen for sharing some airtime so early in the episode. In this upcoming conversation with Dolly, she contends our emotions are a big part of culture, any culture. As people who interact with the world through restoration to reclaim what was lost or preventing harm, we form our own culture and tell ourselves stories to deal with collective grief, sadness, and anger. Instead of suppressing or sterilizing emotions, feelings can be a useful knowledge tool, and I am thankful that Dr. Jørgensen nurtures and unpacks them for us. Access to some of these large, abundant, and powerful resources of feelings can motivate us to change or spur us to action. For example, the worldwide movement called Extinction Rebellion formed just 3 years ago and calls on collective action against what they observe as biodiversity loss, crop failure, social and ecological collapse, mass extinction. The local group of Extinction Rebellion in Tacoma works on hyperlocal and global issues, such as fossil fuel expansion in the port, which is a gateway to trade across the Pacific Ocean, as well as oil reserves deeper into Turtle Island. They urge, we are running out of time and our government has failed to act, that we have a moral duty to take action. Dolly dives deep into her 2019 Recovering Lost Species in a Modern Age book about past and ongoing reintroduction of beaver and rewilding muskoxen, as well as the candidate resurrection of the passenger pigeon. Dolly describes how people tell stories about nativeness and belonging for these species they wish back in their lives. Oaks have been on my mind lately, and I inquire with Dolly about what I call preemptive loss, or a foreshadowing of loss. The apocalypse is what we want to avoid. The short segment of Brandon's story speaks to that, or I curated that message in my question and editing of the Oaks story arc. The trees are important to our culture, oaks belong in our community, they are imperiled because of some human disregard, but we have the capacity to intervene before they are gone. Dolly and I even dive into some tales of science fiction, particularly how television, film, and books intersect with history we constantly create. Given the level of climate disruption we are living through, a little science fiction mixed with Western science forewarns us of future degradation to the conditions that support the life we deserve. The suspense and feeling of unease can ramp up for us because no one explicitly reveals what will happen later in our story. Our mind may wander to pseudo-fictitious future scenarios of Dune, Mad Max, etc. I am in the middle of listening to the Octavia Butler novel Parable of the Sower, and we walk through the world through the eyes of the main character, Lauren Alamina, who survives with a superpower of hyper-empathy and rebuilds community in a world turned upside down in part due to climate change. Lauren writes, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change." That is why I'm glad to bring you this episode on recovering lost species. Hopefully it helps you cope with emotions surrounding longing and belonging and helps us get in right relationship with change, each other, and the wider environment. Dolly also reminds us that we feel a sense of love, even for things we haven't even seen. It starts right here. Enjoy this conversation with Dolly Jørgensen.
Hi, I'm Dolly Jørgensen, and I'm a professor of history at the University of Stavanger in Norway. I'm an environmental historian, so I am very interested in how relations between humans and the non-human world, in particular animals, have happened in the past, and those past relationships continue to affect how we are today. And I'm also the editor of the journal Environmental Humanities, which is a journal that looks a little broader than just history into fields like literature, religious studies, film studies, geography, to think about all the ways in which human-environment relations can be looked at and seen through these various fields, and have a conversation together about what that means for our environmental moment today.
Thank you so much. So how you orient yourself academically is through environmental humanities. It's a new field for me. So just like probably restoration is some obscure niche like thing for a lot of other people. So could you tell us just a little bit more about the origin behind environmental humanities, like where it came from?
Sure. So it's really only about a decade old, a little bit more now. It became an interest from a number of different places at the same time. So there were some historians who were interested in this. There were also some philosophers who became very interested in trying to think about environmental questions and how we could use some of the tools that come from the disciplines which look at culture, we can say. So all of our humanities disciplines are about, well, humans. And why do humans do the things humans do? How we express that through our actions and through our literature and through our practices and through our culture. And so about a decade ago, people started thinking, we could really get together as disciplines and start to have some conversations across those things. Because what you see is that, well, as a historian, I don't just have to use historical records, so a standard kind of memo from a governmental agency, but I can also use literature, right? A novel, when it's written, will affect the way it tells its story, the way it deals with environment. Or a piece of art includes with it human environment relations. So we can really reach across the discipline. So think a little broader about some big concerns that we all have. But I am a historian myself. So I am interested in the past and the way that the past influences today.
I also heard you were or are an engineer. So you
That's
had this
right.
mixed background. Is that right? How do
That
you
is
think,
right.
Does that still creep in to your work every once in a while?
It sure does. So I have my first degree is a bachelor's in civil engineering with a specialty in environmental engineering. Okay. So I worked as an environmental engineer for consulting firms. I did a lot of work actually in waste site permitting, in environmental assessment reports, in chemical inventories. So this kind of thing. And then I decided I really wanted to go back to university and study history. And in doing that, I decided that, but it made sense to use my environmental background in my history. So even though my first studies were all in medieval history, which you'd go, wow, that's totally different than an environmental engineer today. But my PhD was actually on urban sanitation, so on waste in the city, which made a lot of sense considering I'd worked a lot on waste in the city, but today. And so I've continued in my work. I have a project that I've worked on for a number of years on offshore oil structures and their usage as artificial reef. And so that really comes both from thinking about environmental history, but also my environmental engineering and the fact that I was in Houston, Texas, worked with a lot of oil. So it's definitely been an influence in the way I look at environmental issues.
So I did watch a YouTube talk of you too, and you were talking about the bats roosting on the bridge. And that made me think like either it was like a mistake by the engineers, like a happy mistake by the engineers, perhaps, that created this beautiful habitat for these bats to roost.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's in Austin, and it was not intentional at all. So it's a perfect case of how you can do something that's completely non-intentional, but the animals found that it was useful for them. And so, in fact, the work that I'm just now coming back to is back to that work to look at unintentional usages of our infrastructure by animals and how we respond to that. So are we willing to accept them in those places, or do we want to push them out? right? Do you want to get rid of them? We do that a lot, right? With urban pigeons, for example. You put up spikes on buildings, you put up netting on buildings to try and keep them off of the statues because you look at them as harmful to those structures. So I'm interested in how that's developed over time. When did people start deciding that that was something we should do? Are other ways of making a city habitable by non-human inhabitants that allow us to work together?
That's excellent. Yeah, and I am interested in reimagining restoration in so many ways because, again, we create these divisions about what's restoration and what is a restorative practice, so at least from some institutions, the way they define it. So this book I just read of yours called Recovering Lost Species in the Modern Age, and the subtext is Histories of Longing and Belonging, has been out for a few years. And so I was lucky enough to get a hold of it because you gave a talk at the SCR World Conference a few months ago, which is virtual. And so I tuned in and I was really taken by some of the stories you told. And reading the book, I mean, just the foreword and the first chapter was just solid gold. Your perspective was really fascinating about restoration. And you note that restoration is about finding and recovering the lost, and that we feel loss, and restoration potentially motivates us as the way to recover plants and animals that don't exist anymore. So in your experience, do you feel like it's human-centered desires and imagination motivating us or a love for other life, or biophilia, some people might feel?
Well, this is a really interesting question. I think each kind of history will have its own mix of those two things. I think that it's impossible to actually get away from human-centered desire because even being biophilic is still actually a human-centered desire. So you are still as a human deciding. You're making a conscious decision, or sometimes it's unconscious, but it's a decision that something is worth having again. And so that's always an underlying factor, I think, in every restoration project, because people are going out and doing a study or going and seeing that something is wrong. Well, that wrongness is automatically a decision that we've said, that we've analyzed. I mean, you can argue that it may come from some numbers, it may come from a study, but that's still a choice. We still are deciding that those are valuable measures to come up with something. So the human is always in the picture with restoration. That doesn't, however, mean that the humans are not considering the non-humans in that decision-making process. So often I see that people in restoration care deeply about their non-human subjects. They really care about the beavers, or they really care about a particular plant species that they're going to be spreading out new seeds or trying to take to an area that had been changed because of industrial use or something. So they care about the environment. So I had worked in a restoration ecology group in northern Sweden at Umeå University. And there, all the restoration practitioners in the specific group I worked in worked with the restoration of rivers that had been changed because of timber floating in northern Sweden and because of damming. So those two things combined together changed all these water courses. And now they were going and trying to figure out what were the right restorative measures to take them back to some semblance, and what was it we were taking them back to? Was that even possible? And so they care deeply about the water courses themselves, about the river and the water, how it's flowing. They care about the fish that are in it. They care about the mussels that are found in particular ones. But it still is a human-centered desire to have the river as it somehow was once in the past.
That's right. So I think you delve really into loss, right? So, and how that can be wrapped up in the stages of grief too. You talk a lot about sort of the feelings behind that and how that could motivate us. So the past what it looked like gets changed over time with stories and different myths that we tell each other. Can you talk a little bit more about how loss fits into this?
Absolutely. So the thing that I look at in the book is how emotions fit into restoration, right? So it's not just an objective thing. It's very much a subjective thing. People are motivated by how they feel emotionally about something. And what I argue is that people get attached to their environments, to particular parts of those environments. So in this case, species, which then when those species aren't there, there's a feeling of something being missing, of something being lost, right? Like a lost and found poster is how I start the book. And that is then a motivation to go out and find it. Well, it's gone. Let's have it back again. Something is there's a hole, if you will, a hole in your heart, a hole in the environment that you want to fill again. And what I found in my histories, and it's interesting because I didn't start out looking for it. The book I ended up writing is not the book I thought I was going to write when I started the project. But what I discovered in examining these histories of restoring species that have become extinct from a particular area, at least in a couple of the cases, and extinct entirely in the case of the passenger pigeon, what I found was that people in the past, as well as today, were heavily motivated by emotion, by this sense of loss, by this sense of wanting to recover that lost thing. And that, yes, as you mentioned, that's wrapped up with all kinds of emotions, like the stages of grief that are talked about. So it's wrapped up with emotions of sadness, but also anger, of denial. It's wrapped up with emotions of guilt, of thinking, well, we did something wrong. I mean, it might be me. I might have done something wrong, but it also is our forefathers, our ancestors, who we can say, well, they did something wrong, so we need to fix it now, right? And a lot of restoration actually functions that way. But there's a sense then of guilt that comes with that I'm guilty for it. And so that can be a motivating factor. And there's also a sense of hope. It doesn't have to be a negative emotion. It can be a very positive emotion that motivates restoration and saying, well, it isn't all bad. There's actually hope that we can make a difference. Throughout that all, I also say that there's love. Love is also an emotion and an emotional attachment, that you can have this sense of love even for things you haven't ever seen. And this is what's interesting as a historian, is that we can be talking about species that haven't been in a landscape for a person's lifetime. So they haven't been there because they've been extinct in these cases. And yet there's still an emotional attachment to them in the case of these actors that I look at in these histories. And so I think that's important to recognize for those practitioners who are working in restoration, that you can actually have, both admitting your own emotional attachments of why you're doing the things you're doing, but also that the public can have emotional attachments. You can use that emotion to help them to see why restoration might be important.
Right. And there's so many examples, and you pepper them throughout some of the writings and from your website as well, from what I've seen. But in the book, you really delve into the reintroduction of beaver, rewilding of musk oxen, and resurrection of the passenger pigeon locally here too. I'm working on a different story, but it's just like 6 miles away from me. Some folks that are working to protect oaks. These oaks that have live among us. There's the native Gary oak or Oregon white oak, or it's Quercus garryana. There's really only like 1 to 5% of the habitat left on the west coast of where we live here. Can you give us our thoughts on how people have negotiated the narrative around nativeness and belonging for some of these species that you have really studied?
Absolutely here. So it's, I mentioned the longing part of the title, right? But then this question gets to the belonging. part of the title. So how do these things belong? And what I thought in my histories is that often that decision that a species should be in the landscape is tied to these emotional states of being, that is tied to our sense of loss. So in the case of beavers, I look at the extinction of the beaver, which happened in the late 1800s. The beavers were no longer there. And when conversations start happening in the 1910s and 1920s about the beaver, and that, well, but the beaver belongs here. They talk about both the stories people tell about the beavers, so it's a cultural connection to beavers that make it belong. There's also the landscape itself. So they talk about there being still beaver channels, remnants of beaver structures, dams, because those can last hundreds of years, actually. So they mentioned that, but they also mentioned that, but the place is actually named for beavers. So the word beaver is in the place name. So that means beavers belong. So there's both the physical, biological reality of beavers, but there's also the cultural reality of beavers. There's an idea of the memory of beavers in life, in culture, in history for them. And so therefore they belong. They belong there. And so the group in Sweden goes about then the process of finding beavers from southern Norway and bringing them back. And the other cases are similar. There are always kind of negotiations about what belongs and what doesn't. And the muskox is really interesting in that case, because muskoxen have not been in Scandinavia for a few thousand years. Since the end of the last, ice age, right, Scandinavia, then they went extinct. And, so do they belong here or not? Now, in the 1930s, when discussions were going on and a group from the Norwegian Polar Institute, or what becomes the Polar Institute, decided to bring them from Greenland to Norway, the thinking there was, well, but we did have them and we have the right environment for them, and they would make the landscape wilder, right? So it's in many ways, just like the rewilders today talk about what they're doing. But this was in the 1930s. And so, for the people involved, then the muskoxen belonged. Why would they not belong? Right. Interestingly, though, people who actually lived in the mountains where they put out the muskoxen did not think that the muskox belonged at all, because the muskox had not been there. They'd not been there as long as there'd been farms there. So for them, it was very much not the same emotional response at all to the muskox. And so in that chapter of the book, what I look at is how that can be very different, right? In their case, they very much feared the muskox. And when a group of them move over the border to Sweden, because it's not like there's a fence, right? You just walk across, how you see the exact same emotional difference. So people that were interested in nature conservation, biologists, they were all, yay, this is wonderful to have the muskox back. The muskox belongs here. And the people who were local inhabitants, working their farms, working the reindeer herds that are in those same areas, are like, whoa, muskox not belong here. It hasn't been here. So it's interesting how you can have very different reactions to the same thing, which I think is also a really important message for the restoration community, because it's not just about that you give people more information and somehow they'll come on your side, if you will, of a project like that. You have to recognize that they have different motivations. They have different ways of seeing the world. And so those people that brought the muskoxen from Greenland saw the world in a different way than the local farmers.
Right. And I remember the stories. It's like once the state gets involved too, it becomes very complicated, and trying to rewild on scale too gets complicated. I can see some analogs too to the wolf reintroductions in the United States, trying to right the wrongs of, settler colonialism as well too. And it can be fairly, academic, where we can debate about things in the urban areas, but really, we're not reintroducing muskox into, my backyard in Tacoma. We have a hard enough time living with like coyotes and deer and raccoons and possum, things like that. Those are like the wild animals around here. So people fear for their property, right? Because we parcelize things and enclose the commons. So that's complicated. And then people fear for their lives because they're like, it seems like even if the muskoxen have only charged and killed like a few people, it's a threat, right?
Exactly. And so it's interesting, you mentioned that split between the way people view things often has to do with where they sit, right, in the issue. And that's what I saw in the Muskoxen case very clearly, was where people were, whether they were urban looking out to the rural versus the people who actually were in the rural, reacted very differently to this idea of rewilding the Scandinavian countryside with muskox, which are there. They're still there. They were reintroduced. There are herd of muskox. But it's still a contentious thing. There are still some people who don't want them there. There are still issues. Things like an animal getting struck by a train. What does that do? Well, the train needs to stop. You end up causing infrastructural problems as well as, you killed the animal. But so how does this function? When they wander into town, how does it work? So, there's currently a Norwegian muskox management plan, which draws a line on a map and says, well, if the muskox is out of that, then the muskox manager will go take it down. So we have these ways to try and deal with the wild being too wild. Yeah, so we always like somehow on paper to have rewilded things and more animals and more vegetation and more environment. But at the same time, those things cause problems for some people.
We want things to be wild, but not too wild. And then you've also, really helped to define kind of what rewilding is and maybe isn't, or at least hanging around those borders of those definitions. Yeah, my first episode I ever did was with this gentleman named Jacob Mills, and really actually kicked off this whole podcast. It was about microbiome rewilding. So that was the term that he used. I don't know if you've ever thought of that term, like in contrast to the megafauna, saber-toothed tigers, like all those things. On the very, microscopic level, like how we've changed the outside world, but we've also changed like our inside world, like what's on the inside. I don't know if does that ever come into your view when you think about rewilding?
Well, I actually did have a conversation with Jamie Lorimer, who recently wrote a book called Probiotic Planet that was along these lines. So it's about this rewilding of the gut and projects to do that. And he's also coming at it from an environmental humanities perspective. So I think, there are some people looking at it on these different kind of scales, because you also have, so my book is about species, but you can also think, well, there's whole landscape scales, right? One of the big things in rewilding is that we should be doing much larger scales than what we have thought about with restoration of, say, one species. So I think that those kind of scales, you can think across all of those when we think about rewilding and restoration and what it means. And you're right, in my book, I look specifically at megafauna. I mean, they are, right? Beavers and muskox and passenger pigeons and bears. But we don't have to. And certainly there are restoration and rewilding projects that have to do with very small things, and not just microscopic, but grasshoppers and ants with small orchids. So, and all of those, I think, though, would follow the same kind of patterns, in that there's still an emotional attachment to those things. There's an idea that they've been lost or will be lost, right? Because I was dealing with things that are actually extinct, But I think a lot of times restorationists are also dealing with things that they're afraid will become extinct. And so that fear, again, is an emotion. You're actually afraid that they're going to become extinct, that they're going to be lost. And so therefore, you're going to try your best to help them to recover.
Yes. Good segue, because I have definitely a question about that. Because for me today, it's in the 90-degree range Fahrenheit, which is hot. And then there's smoke in the air from forest fires. And so thinking about climate disruption today, at least when it's hot, I wondered if you've thought about climate, because I noticed, I don't know if you do, that some people feel this kind of preemptive loss due to like how science can like model things, and also given our experience in extincting things in the past. But I also feel like there's maybe some blending of myths of science fiction also. I don't know if you're a science fiction fan.
I've actually written some articles about science fiction, about extinction in science fiction, and how that's used. So for the Star Trek fans out there, there's an article about Star Trek and extinct animals. And one of the stories is about restoration and how there's a pair of this last species that the Enterprise is transporting to another planet so that they can establish a population there on that planet. So absolutely. So science fiction is interesting to think about the ways it both thinks about the future, but how it thinks about the present is also interesting. But yeah, you're right. I mean, this week came out with a new IPCC report, and the dire situation that we're in that many things are past points in which they can just be, they can't just be stopped. In other words, processes are happening and are underway. We still have choices to make to have the results be as best as they can be for humans and for others who are affected by the warming planet and, more broad changes to, the weather systems. Here at the same time, in Norway, we're really concerned because, of course, some studies are showing that the Gulf Stream is continuing to slow down because of changing climate regimes. And if that happens while everybody else is getting warmer, we're going to be colder and have a lot more unpredictable changes in weather. But we can do this, right? Exactly. We can look at those future casts and we can have a sense of loss already, a loss for what is to come. And this climate anxiety is a real thing. And there are scholars that are trying to look at that, how it functions and how can we harness it, eco-anxiety. We see it a lot in not just science fiction, but other kinds of films and movies. But science fiction is a particularly good one.
Do you have other favorites? I don't know. We could just rattle them off. So Star Trek, seems like you're a Star Trek fan.
Yeah.
Mad Max comes to mind, with the total apocalypse, or like Waterworld.
So you look enough into the future. I'm thinking here about Silent Running. So the ships that are out in space that are the botanical gardens, and they're the last vegetation from Earth that's out in space, and caring for that over generations.
Like the Martian, right? He was a botanist, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And figures out a way to survive by using those skills. But it's really about kind of making biology, making an ecosystem bloom, if you will, on Mars when it shouldn't. So I think a lot of times these kind of visions are something we're thinking about because they encapsulate this sense of loss that we feel for the environment. But they also tell us what are possibilities, right? How do you respond to that sense of loss? So I've written a piece about Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is Blade Runner, so in movie form. But the book, what's interesting about the book by Philip Dick is that it looks much more at the animal relationship. There's some in Blade Runner, but it's not nearly as much as you get if you actually read the book. Here it's about how animals have all gone extinct. And even in Blade Runner, the movie, there's this scene where Deckard encounters this owl, and he says, but it can't be a real owl because owls are extinct. And the android Rachel insists to him that no, it's a real owl, but then later admits that it's not a biological owl because, yes, of course, owls are all extinct. And what you find out in the book is that, well, everything's basically gone extinct, all the animals. And this is why animals are so expensive. So people buy animals as their pet and they're attached to them. They have this emotional attachment and they project their feelings onto Deckard's case, a sheep, and later then a Nubian goat that he buys. It's a case where you can see how that is actually a reflection of people now. So although Dick's trying to write about some potential future scenario where there's been nuclear war and everything's died, but it still is about the human condition. We're still attached to things. We want to restore them. We're upset and have a sense of loss when they've gone extinct. And that's part of us right now, not just a potential future. So I think science fiction and literature like that is really interesting to look at for how that functions. And in that case, what happens in the novel is that electronic animals are the replacement for real biological animals. And while we can say, well, that'll never happen, at the same time, there are developments going on to try and come up with electric bees because, well, what if all the bees die?
No, looking for surrogates, functional replacements for things, for
absolutely.
To supply
that's
ecosystem services and things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's a standard kind of approach in restoration, right? Is, well, if you don't have the taxon that you had, you replace it with something else. And it can be something pretty different, in fact. So I know of one project where they had previously ground-dwelling birds, but those are extinct. And so they introduced tortoises because they would do the same function as the ground-dwelling birds had done. So this is precisely, so if we think science fiction, we can also see, this is why we think that way. This is why we do the things we do.
All right. Yep. And there's weeds too that facilitate diversity as well. So there's like a little butterfly, that's on the verge of extinction up in the San Juan Islands, near me. And the plant that they nectar on or host on is gone, but I think they use a mustard or a couple different other plants now. And so you have to manage, either figure out some way how to reintroduce that plant that may be locally extinct, or manage that weed in a way to help preserve the life of the butterfly. And I don't know if you could help me grapple with one of my issues is with weeds and my relationship with weeds, because pretty much through my career, I used to get really bent out of shape about weeds, just like things that we think don't belong. Almost, maybe I don't know if it's the opposite. Yeah. So not thinking about things that we think should belong, but things that we don't think belong, right? And so that is something that my brain has been revolving around lately, because in some ways we are resisting and trying to resist ecosystem change and environmental change. And we could do that in some places, but in other places, the ecosystem doesn't respond the way we want. Over a few decades, our urban forests have changed. And now a couple species, particularly ivy and blackberry, are the two kind of dominant species that take up a lot of space. Sometimes they displace other native plants, but we spend a lot of time thinking that these are wastelands almost in some cases, and spend a lot of time removing something and replacing it with what we think belongs, right? So that's my thing.
And this is always a debate, right? What belongs? What belongs here and what doesn't? And because you're right, a huge amount of restoration is actually taking out stuff that is there, and that decisions again are made that those things are not what be there. And there's all kinds of judgments then that have gone into those words to come up with that shouldness, but we do it all the time. And so sometimes we look then at history to say, why are those particular species there, right? So what were the historical conditions that brought those in? And are those conditions things that we're happy with or not? And you see this particularly right now because of climate change. Species are moving themselves. And so we can't just think, oh, well, was this species here 200 years ago, which most of the places, most countries have these kind of rules about what counts as native based on time. That's problematic, I feel.
In Australia, I read a paper, I'm reading a few papers all the time, but one is like, Australia in the 1700s, I think, right?
Right.
And
so it comes with colonization, colonization. In Australia. So when you get white colonizers come, you change the makeup of Australia. And this is very true. And in Europe, a lot of times that amount is set at, something like 1800, 1850. They're looking at industrialization. So are you an industrial nation? Are you not? So a lot of times that gets set, but some places get set by certain regimes or colonial regimes. And there are good reasons for that on one hand, but on another, we can think, but why did the species come? Or how did the species come? And it's interesting to think about because, so take the case of the raccoon dog. So the raccoon dog is a Asian species, and it was taken to Russia and Ukraine and farmed in fur farming. So they use it for fur. And then, over time, some of them get loose, places shut down. They, just let out the animals. So raccoon dogs establish themselves. And then they start, doing what species do, which is to expand, right? And move or find good habitat. The environment suited them. So some started coming into Finland. And then coming across up at the very top of where Finland connects to Sweden and start coming into Sweden. And some come down and are coming in.
Sorry, they're super cute. I don't know. I've never heard of I've never heard of them. I was listening to you. I was Googling it at the same time because I was like, I want a follow-up question about this. And they're adorable.
Well, so then the question with raccoon dogs is, right, they've gotten into Sweden because they've gotten into Finland because they were in fur farms. But at what point are raccoon dogs like, but this is somehow natural? I mean, so them being in a farm in Russia is obviously not their natural condition. But how much time as beings should you be allowed that, okay, but now you've settled there, right?
Yeah, and they're somewhat ubiquitous, right? And they're natural.
And of course, in the case of the raccoon dog, what happens though is it has to do with human-centered needs. Raccoon dogs carry parasites that can be transmitted to other animals, like hunting dogs, for example. So therefore they're seen as they don't belong. And I mean, we can say, naturally, and I'm going to put in, air quotes there, their habitat would be in far Asia. And so they don't belong in Scandinavia. But of course, nothing was in Scandinavia before the glaciers went up. Humans weren't in Scandinavia, but nothing else was either. So we sometimes have problems with change at the moment. That a lot of times, as I see it in restoration, we want things to be somehow fixed, that there's an ideal, again, in air quotes, state that those things should be in, that we can look to history for that, and that we can then try and remake it. The problem is that things actually aren't fixed like that. They're always in flux. Right. And that, I think, as a historian, I think it's a bad idea to use history as a way of saying, this is the baseline and it should look like this because that somehow existed at a particular moment in time in the past. Because lots of states have actually existed in the past. It depends which past you go back to, right? So if I go back 100 years, if I go back 1,000, let me go back 10,000, let me go back 100,000. This particular place of land might not even been land in the past. But so if you're gonna do that, I think you have to realize that you've made decisions. You've made choices. And as long as you're okay with that and you recognize that and you justify that and say, well, these are the reasons I've made those choices, then it's fine. And so as a historian, I object to people who just say, well, but this is how it was in X year. And so this is how it has to be.
That's good. Those are great thoughts. I think you might have answered my last question. Just advice to give restorationists when they're kind of coming to terms with environmental history or ecological history, right? I've also heard of this concept that's been around for a while, this portfolio approach. And I think that's what I'm trying to strategize about in my own work, is that you can, in some places, you could try to turn the clock back because that has some value, in these ravines that are cool and moist, where there's streams, there's a lot of opportunities those might be somewhat resilient as a refuge from climate change, right? And then there's some areas you can experiment with because they're not responding to our traditional methods of restoration, and you can manage them for the future, like for change and get in right relationship with change in some ways, and almost like that novel ecosystem approach that's evolving. And then other places, if you have enough space or if it's just not economically efficient or effective, is to just let things go on their own, just like kind of hands off. So in some areas we just have like really steep slopes come to mind. Like where I am, you talk about the glaciers carved Puget Sound, right? The Salish Sea. So we have land and we're right next to this big, huge estuary, and the glacier just carved that out. So we are left with these big high bluffs, just sandy bluffs that just traditionally would just crumble and fall into the ocean, right? And now there are those places where it's just, there's a certain forest type that exists there. A lot of times it's a lot of blackberries and just weeds, and you just let things assemble. So more and more, that's kind of what I think about, instead of just trying to copy and paste the same thing over and over.
Exactly. Being a bit more flexible in our understandings of how ecosystems, should be. Sometimes we need to just say, well, let it be as it's going to. And I mean, I don't want to say that you shouldn't use history. And in fact, you should. I think a lot of times we need to, I would say that people in restoration and people in ecology should be looking not only to the ecological history, so what trees were there or how big a water course was or what species was there, but to cultural history, to actually talking to historians. Why were the changes made that you're seeing now? What are the causes of the change of relationship between humans and environment that is causing the situation that you have now? So to really understand the culture, to understand the choices that people have made, why they feel the way they do about the environment, about particular things. So I'd done a study with a colleague in the department working on the restoration ecology about dam removals. And so she had been, she's an ecologist and she's all for dam removals and then putting back these river courses as they were prior to industrialization. And she just really couldn't understand why people would not want dams to be removed, and kind of thought, well, you just need to educate them about how they're going to have back, the fish, and how they're going to have back the river as it's supposed to be. But what I looked at in writing it with her was to try and talk about, well, what are the values that those people who don't want the dam removed, what are their ways of understanding nature, of understanding environment? Because in this case, they wanted the lake that's created by a dam. That they knew very well that, okay, you take out the dam, it's going to make a nice river. But that's not what they wanted. They wanted the lake that had been there their whole life. They wanted the species that live around that, not the species that live in a fast-flowing river. I think you can't, so you have to look at why those feelings have come up historically. What's the cultural reference for those people in that situation to understand why they think what they do. And so this is really important, I think, for restorationists to think that way and to ask people who are good at that kind of study, which is a very different kind of study than what most ecologists do. So I think this is my call for, trying to reach beyond your particular speciality and academic silo to thinking about culture as an important aspect that you bring into your work, and that you're actually always dealing with people's history and their culture right now. And that in my book, in looking at emotions, a big part of that culture is emotional. Mm-hmm. And it's both a part of the scientists, their emotions, why are you doing what you're doing, and people, historical and today, about why they do what they do.
Such great advice. That's beautiful. You're making me feel my own feelings right now. It's really uncomfortable, but it's okay. It's so great. So there's also another question I ask everybody about their favorite trees. So I want to give you that opportunity before we have to part ways today.
Yeah, I was thinking about that question, having been tipped about it and the favorite tree. I love cherry trees. I love cherry blossoms. There's something about and they can be white, they can be pink, you can kind of have, to dark colors to very, very light. But there's something about just the explosion all at once of a cherry tree. And of course, it's so fleeting, right? It's a very short amount of time that a cherry tree has its blossoms. I had the opportunity a few years ago to go to Shanghai, China, and I was there at the Cherry Blossom Festival. And so they have this big urban park where it had hundreds of varietals of cherry blossom trees. And it was absolutely stunning to be in that space, to see all the insects flitting around, to really feel the trees making new. And so I love cherry blossoms. And we have here in Stavanger, just south of town, we have an arboretum. And in that arboretum, there's one very large old cherry tree that's next to a little pond. And if you catch it just right, you get the pink blossoms. And this year I happened to be there when parents and some kids were taking their pictures under, these falling blossoms as the wind was blowing them down. And it was just fantastic.
Yeah, I'm actually looking. There's a photo right on my wall over here of my son at the cherry blossoms in a Seattle, Washington Park Arboretum. And I lived in Washington, D.C. for a while too. So there's a lot around the reflection pool there. And yeah, cherries are good. No one has said cherries yet. So that's a good one. Don't have to talk about the same trees over and over. I just want to give people an opportunity to connect with your work some more. I think you just invited me to a book club too. So how can people, I know you're on maybe Twitter and you have a website. How can people stay in touch with your work?
So my handle is at Dolly Jørgensen. So you can find me if you put that in. So my last name has a Norwegian letter normally. So it's Jørgensen. It has an O with a slash through it. But when you do something like Twitter, it's just an O. So Dolly Jørgensen. And I do also have a website where I have my publications and research profile if you're interested in things about both restoration, extinction, also the offshore oil rigs to reefs, as well as some other things that I've worked on. All of that's on my website. So that is dolly.jrgensen web. So Jørgensen web is one word, .net. So dolly.jrgensenweb.net. And anybody's welcome to take a look at my things there and, drop me a line. And of course, my book out with MIT Press. It came out in October of 2019. Unfortunately, that was not long at all before the COVID shutdowns. So I was very happy to get this invitation to talk about it. because almost all of the book talks that I had scheduled had to be canceled because of COVID. So it's Recovering Lost Species in the Modern Age, Histories of Longing and Belonging with MIT Press, which you can get at your, through any local book ordering facility you want, as well as directly on the MIT Press website. Also, I run a book talk of people in environmental humanities, so kind of the broader field. It's not just history, but literature, philosophy, geography, anthropology, religion that have to do with environment. And so my husband and I host a talk like this with authors of their book. So I'm actually used to talking about books, right? But from the other side. I'm usually the one asking the questions. If it's something you're interested in, it's open on Monday afternoons. They're all recorded, and they're actually we record them as videos, but we've been talking about just transferring over the audio to make it a podcast also, so that it would be on a channel.
Sweet. Yes. This is a treasure trove. So many books, so little time. And I can link all those things in the show notes so people have access to them in your app and on the treehuggerpod.com website. And so I really appreciate you coming on the show, Dolly, and connecting, so into your evening, into your nighttime, maybe bedtime hour. I appreciate it. Across the ocean, and it's so cool that we can connect.
Great.
Well, this is great stuff.
Okay.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for the call.
All right. Thanks for finding Tree Hugger Podcast again and tuning into this discussion with Dolly Jørgensen. You can now donate to the show. In the show description, showing in your app, and at the Tree Hugger website, there's a PayPal and now a Venmo link. Both handles are @mjadrik. The equipment and software subscriptions needed to keep this show running aren't cheap. You might think I'm sitting in a fancy studio, but there are no sponsors here. Really, I'm just sitting in my living room, editing and listening to reggaeton. If you enjoy the content, or if you think the conversations are important for folks to hear around the world, please pitch in a little. Seriously, around the world. People are listening in Australia, Italy, the UK, Auburn, Washington, British Columbia, and Hawaii. I have asked, and people have tutored me on how to say tree hugger in other languages. Chipko in Hindi. In Espanol se llama abrazador de árboles. Aloha Aina means the love of the Aina. Land, skies, seas, and everything in between that feeds physically, spiritually, and intellectually. It takes a community to keep a podcast going. Next up on the podcast, we're going to bring you a local story from the South Puget Sound. I admire some of my neighbors that are mobilizing to protect our oak trees and challenge environmental racism in their community. Over the past couple months, I've been collecting recordings and sit down to talk with folks in Lakewood, Washington about their relationship with chadats, aka Oregon white oak, Gary oak, or Quercus garryana. They are concerned that the city isn't doing enough or anything to protect and restore their last remaining oaks. Here's a piece of that conversation.
And personally, I'm not a tree hugger. I'm not political.
I'm also not a tree hugger. I just want to see this town stay viable for future residents.
I'm not a tree hugger, right? But my city asked people to come over here and talk for these Jerry Oak trees, and I'm here for my city, for the people who can't stand up for themselves, the people who are scared of y'all, you know what I mean?
I'm not a tree hugger either, to be honest with you. If it were not for Savannah Ayuso, I probably wouldn't be here. However, the longer I sat here, I realized I need to be here.
A lot of people out here have been saying that they ain't tree huggers. I am. I hugged one out in the parking lot because, it's shading my car. It's going to help me breathe tonight. So I consider myself a tree hugger. Everybody's been talking about the warehouses that you guys have built.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to make comments this evening. My name is Christina Minetti, like you just heard, and I've lived in Lakewood for just under half a century. Today, I would like to comment on tree preservation and protection in light of the recent historic, and let's be frank, quite apocalyptic, if you ask me, heat wave.
I'm grateful you have joined me for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrik. Please check the show description for information about Dolly Jørgensen, or you can find out more about her online at treehuggerpod.com. We are on social media at treehuggerpod, so feel free to point people in our direction. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. It helps people find the show. or tell a friend about the show. The music for the show you heard was some tunes from Dan Lebowitz, Jeremy Blake, and Soy Amelia. One can find a link to them in the show description. Thanks for hanging out.